So this is probably a good time to go to the roots of this.
Yep.
You know, why? I mean, one of the things I love about your writing is, and we've talked about this, is that you like looking at the status quo, figuring out how we got there, and then trying to argue why we don't have to be there. We could be somewhere else. So, so you know, I think HBR was probably somewhat responsible for the rise of this theory. But talk a little bit about how shareholder capitalism sort of took this paramount position in the first place.
Yeah. It really stemmed from, interesting enough, to me at least, it stemmed from one article. And an article by two guys, one a good friend of mine, Michael Jensen, and the other by the late Bill Meckling. They were both together at the Simon School in Rochester together, and wrote an article called "The Theory of the Firm" that established the notion of agency theory, and what it said is that you have principals who own the company, agents who they hire to manage the company for them, and even though there's sort of this assumption that because they're paid for by the principals that the agents do what the principals want, that in fact the agents are self-interested and maximize their own value rather than that of the principals, and therefore you've got a principal-agent problem, and you've got agency costs, which is the costs of the performance of the company that is less than the cost it could be if the agents behaved well. And they said the way to solve that is to align the interests of shareholders and management by giving management stock-based compensation. Why? Because then if the principals win, the agents win. Right? If the agents win, the principals win. You've got them aligned. And it turns out, I mean, I have very few perks. I'm on the board of Thomson Reuters, and I have very few perks from this. But the one perk I have, because they own ISI, the citation database, Thomson Scientific, I could go to them and say, listen, you don't publish this, but can you tell me what are the highest cited articles in the history of Business Academy? And sure enough, the Jensen-Meckling article is the most cited article in the history of all writing in all business journals. So it had profound influence, and it had profound influence, I think, Adi, because it was a nice, simple, again, it was one of these simple equations. It was, if they win, we win. Alignment, this is perfect. And so that's where it stemmed from. And before 1976, stock-based compensation is new. Before 1976, less than 1% of the compensation of large American company CEOs was in the form of stock-based compensation, right? So the odd company had a little bit of it here and there. That's it. And soon after that article, it was up to 50% of the compensation. So that's the roots of it was one like simple, easy to understand, logically sensible theory that just took hold like wildfire.
Which is part of why it's hard to unravel. I mean,
yes.
I've talked to plenty of CEOs who get it, who get that there's a problem here, who want to be good people and want to drive long-term growth and not merely meet the stock price. But they also like the simplicity of having a single metric that is a judge of their performance. And as you say, it's aligned to shareholders broadly. And it's not perfect, but it's simple. And so it becomes very, we have these discussions, we talk about everything at the end of the day. They say, this is a very handy metric. It's hard to do better. So I guess that's where we are.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think to sort of understand why it's not quite as lovely as it seems, I think you got to go back to football, right? And say, okay, so expectations. So we know the stock price is simply the collective expectations of all investors in the marketplace at any given time. Let's think about expectations and about meeting and beating those expectations. Think about football. Think about the beloved New England Patriots. I lived in Boston long enough when they were terrible to kind of be like a Cubs type fan for them. Now they're good, which is nice. But in 2 years ago, they had the perfect regular season. 16-0. First team to go 16-0 in the regular season. We had 14-0 for the Dolphins in the 72, but first team to go 16-0. So perfect in the real market. Absolutely perfect. But if you looked in the expectations market, and what is accomplishment in the expectations market? It means beating the point spread, right? Doing better than the point spread would suggest you do, right? Which is like beating earnings expectations. They were a mediocre 10-6 against the spread, right? And 10-6, I mean, it's like 8-8 on average. Everybody's going to be 8-8 against the spread, just like on average everybody's got the same rating. So they're records, so they're mediocre against the spread. Cleveland Browns missed the playoffs and with a 10-6 record, and were 12-4 against the spread. So they weren't even top against anywhere close to top against the spread. How did that happen? They went 8-0 against the spread in the first 8 games of the season because they actually weren't expected to do that well by the bettors early on, but they kept beating the spread 8 times. What happened in the back half of the season? 2-6 against the spread. Why? Were they playing badly? No, we know they won all the games, and they won them by a lot. But the spreads had widened so much, the point spreads had widened so much so that actually in the last half of the season they faced the 3 highest point spreads ever recorded in the history of the NFL before or since, including a point spread of 22.5 points over the Dolphins in the second last game of the season. They slaughtered the Dolphins 28-7 and took their foot off the accelerator in the second half, but didn't beat the spread. This is an incredibly important lesson. The lesson is no matter how good you are, you cannot meet expectations forever because expectations have no bounds. Right? You can keep performing better forever. Right? A company like General Electric, over the course of time, over 100 years, or Procter & Gamble over 170 years, actually keeps getting bigger and selling more and making more money and everything. But you can't beat expectations forever because they have no bounds. In the case of the New England Patriots, they had no bounds, and New England couldn't beat them. And that's the problem. People haven't put the 2 and 2 together of that to say it's about meeting. Your compensation is about meeting expectations, and expectations have no bounds. They will eventually get ahead of yourself, and then you've got a problem. And I've written about Google recently. Google's first quarter. Google goes from nothing to a $32 billion company, and then in the first quarter of 2011, their revenue goes up a mere 27 more percent. Their earnings up a mere 17 more percent. They have a 21% after-tax ROE, and they have that despite having they earn that ROE, by the way, with $100 a share of cash on the books. And what happens? Their stock price goes down. They disappointed the analysts, and it's interesting why they disappointed the analysts. They actually had the audacity to hire some people and pay people a 10% promised salary increase. It still made $2.8 billion, right? But they were disappointed. And the stock price is 4 times book. Right? And what does that mean? That means if their cost of equity is 7%, they actually have to make 28% after-tax return on equity to just meet their cost of equity. And so even Google, which is arguably kind of one of the biggest success stories almost in the history of business, can't meet expectations because the expectations are ridiculous. Now, what does Google do? Thankfully, they don't give guidance, and Larry Page just said, we had a fantastic quarter, tremendous quarter, and walked out, didn't answer a single question, bless him. But most CEOs in that case would start doing extreme things to try and somehow meet those expectations until such time as they crash and burn. And that's why, even though it seems like a good idea, it just seems like such a darn good idea to give stock-based compensation, it just isn't.
But part of it is that the stock market changed. I mean, when the theory was written, people tended to buy stock and hold stock and, have their blue chip portfolio. And now we're moving in and out really quickly, and everyone's a shareholder, and, hedge funds. I mean, there's just a lot of things that didn't exist at that point. So is that the issue? It was maybe a theory for its time, but things have changed enough, and we're still in the 60s in terms of the structure.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think I think you can generalize about it and say, with stock-based compensation, a game was created, and whenever a game is created, clever people figure out how to game the game, and what we've had is, I think, successive kind of learning by the various parties involved in the game about how to game it. And the reaction of those people running the game has been to sort of leave it alone because it's the last bastion of capitalism kind of on the planet. And so you can see by behavior, Adi, that early on, executives, when they started getting stock-based compensation, said, I get this. If I make the real performance of my company go up, I will get rich. And they started doing that in the early days of stock-based compensation. And then they came up, then a bunch of them hit this expectations thing and said, whoa, what, time out. If I do really well in this year, expectations go way up, and I can't meet them, and my stock options, the new stock options that I get don't ever get to be worth anything, and I get depressed. So it's actually not about making real performance go up. It's about making expectations go up. And so I'm going to do things like go down to Wall Street and hype the stock, and then I'm going to start do a series of really stupid acquisitions that make us look like we're growing. Then I'm going to do really sharp accounting. I'll change my accounting treatment, and then I'll commit out-and-out fraud. And oh, by the way, now I realize the game is I do have to do all of that in a hurry, and then get out really quickly. And so you can see now CEO tenure shortening, and you can see how many times do you hear the story of a new CEO gets appointed from the outside. And what's the very first thing they do? The very first thing they do when they get to the company. Oh my God, it's so much worse than I thought. Oh, this is terrible. It's awful. And all the analysts say, oh, I guess it's really bad. What happens? Stock tanks. Then what happens? He figures out, or she figures out, that it's not quite as bad as I thought it was, and gets it going up again. And so the stock price gets back. It started at 50. He or she tanks it to $20 quickly, and then a couple of years later it gets it back to 50. And guess what's happened? Shareholders have made what? Zero. The CEO has made what? Gigabucks. Gigabucks. And we have alignment, right? And so that's what's happened. Is that the players have played this game in ever more sophisticated ways, and the stock market players, we've got these new players called hedge funds, and I think one of the things that's changed fundamentally is we now have hundreds of billions of dollars there betting against the market. So it's only recently that we've had gigabucks available to bet against the market. And so before, essentially, the investors were long. And so they had an interest in things going well. Hedge funds now have interest in one thing only. One thing only, right? Movement. They couldn't care less which direction the movement is. They just need movement. The more movement, the better. And so you now have hedge funds getting together and launching short attacks. Of course, they say they don't do that because it's illegal, but it happens all the time on companies just to get volatility, downward volatility, so they can make a bunch of money, and upward volatility. And you've got executives now who've got great interest in volatility. So if you've got kind of a crappy company that you think it's going to be really hard to get its stock price up from $50 to $60, and you want to make a lot of money on the stock price on your stock-based compensation, you now have a fantastic choice, right? You disparage your company, go to Wall Street and say it's a disaster and I got to restructure and fix it. You know the hedge funds will jump all over it and drive the price down. You put up with that for a while, and since you're new, they won't fire you right away. And then you just get it back up. And if you say, oh no, that doesn't really happen, let's think about the S&P 500. October 2007, it hit an all-time high. Right? An all-time high. Let's call that 100. By March of 2009, it was at 43, and everybody lost. Harvard lost its endowment, and everybody lost everything. And guess what it is now? About 85. So that's all we did. We went. Shareholders in general were about flat over that period, but lots and lots of clever executives and hedge funds made gigabucks, just gigabucks, playing this new, more sophisticated game that's all about producing volatility.